Hello, this is Lon Chaney biographer Michael F. Blake, and it is my privilege to provide this audio commentary for one of Lon Chaney's greatest performances in He Who Gets Slapped. The film is based on the play of the same title by Russian playwright Leonid Andreevy, which premiered in the Moscow Art Theater in October 1915. In 1922, the play opened on Broadway with actor Richard Bennett playing the lead role. This 1924 film was the first major release for the newly formed studio Metro-Goldwyn. Louis B. Mayer's name would be added to the studio title 2 years later. MGM, as it was known to many, was the result of a merger of Metro Pictures and Goldwyn Pictures in April 1924. Metro, whose parent company was Loew's Theaters, was in need of more films to supply to their theater chain, but the Metro studio facility in Hollywood was not large enough to handle additional productions. Marcus Loew wound up purchasing Goldwyn Studios in Culver City, which easily could handle Metro's expanding film lineup. In buying the property, Loew also inherited all the films from Goldwyn Pictures produced or in production, including Greed and Ben-Hur. Loew also bought Louis B. Mayer Pictures, hiring the studio executive to oversee the new studio's output. Mayer quickly assigned his assistant, Irving Thalberg, to handle the production details as he had done at Universal. Here we see Lon Chaney as the struggling scientist Paul Beaumont, with Lon relying on a goatee to suggest the character is a scholarly man. Now, this dissolve that you saw from the circus clown to Lon was all done in the camera. There were no optical printers like we have now to do the job. Instead, they would photograph the clown, and then they would wind the film back in the camera magazine several feet. Then they brought in Chaney and filmed the shot with him at the Globe. Needless to say, the camera assistant had to keep a strict record regarding exposed footage. Going back to MGM for a minute, ironically, Sam Goldwyn never had any ownership or connection to the new studio, as he had stepped down from his own company in 1922. He remained an independent producer for the next 37 years, producing such classics as Stella Dallas, Wuthering Heights, and Pride of the Yankees. The MGM studio, as we know it today, well, actually today it's now Sony, but us diehards always will call it MGM. The studio property originally housed Triangle Pictures, and it boasted producers Thomas Ince, D.W. Griffith, and Max Sennett, that they would oversee not only their own productions, but other productions produced by the company. The studio, built in 1915 on land donated by developer Harry Culver, who actually named the city after himself, was located on Washington Boulevard and Overland Avenue. Triangle's residency did not last long, as both Ince and Sennett sold their interests in 1917. Samuel Goldwyn bought the property in 1919, and his logo at the beginning of every Goldwyn picture was the lion, which MGM adopted and made famous, known as Leo the Lion. In this film, many scenes are a harbinger of things to come, especially in the climax. Here we see one when we sense that there could be something deeper between Beaumont's wife, played by Ruth King, and the Baron, played by Marc McDermott. Please check out the photo gallery when you get a chance. It has a lot of neat things. Not only does it have a couple of the lobby cards, which were placed in the theater lobbies for the audience to see, and a window card, which would be placed with the name of the theater and the date it was playing in various store windows. You'll also see a lot of photos, and I have several behind-the-scene photos of Lon on the set. My favorite one is Lon Chaney with his makeup case and Victor Seastrom. And there's also several photos of the deleted scene I mentioned about when Paul Beaumont's character goes to join the circus. And that entire scene was cut out of the film, but there's several photos there for you to take a look at, as well as some great scene shots. And I just think if you're a Chaney fan, you're going to love it. Now here we have Chaney appearing before the Academy of Sciences, where he's going to present his work. Pay attention to the way the scientists are staged, sitting in the booth behind Chaney like that. As you will see later in the film, in the circus, the clowns are situated in a very similar way. Victor Seastrom was really great in directing this film overall, but of course, so many of these scenes are played so well and so subtly. And you see, obviously Chaney here, he realizes he's being taken, that the Baron has stolen his research and material. Marc McDermott was a terrific actor in playing cads in the silent era, and does a wonderful job here without overdoing it. Seastrom was a terrific director in the sense that he kept the actors from overacting and overplaying the scene, which you will see here in a moment with Chaney. Now you'll start to see how Chaney's character now will emotionally unravel, especially here when the Baron slaps Chaney in the face and the reaction of the academics. This public humiliation of being laughed at starts Chaney's character's mental collapse. And again, Chaney plays this so well. He doesn't chew the scenery, he doesn't overdo it. He takes it very slowly. And how expressive, of course, he is with his face and his eyes. And his being laughed at by the scientists after being slapped, the irony comes in that he makes this act later in the circus and becomes popular by being slapped, which kind of is a commentary of the way people can act when people slip and fall. Some people laugh. Certainly if a rich person gets hit in the face with a custard pie, we all laugh. Mo Howard of the Three Stooges once said you can hit a rich dowager in the face with a pie, but you can't hit a mother in the face with a pie. It's not as funny. And this theme of Chaney's character being broken by an emotional instance, and also now he's going to be betrayed by the woman he loves. It's a similar theme you can find in many of his films, pre-MGM and certainly at MGM, with the lost love and never getting the girl. Really, there was only one film where Chaney actually gets a girl, and that was The Shock in 1923. Guess we could also consider While the City Sleeps, because instead of winding up with Anita Page, Chaney's character winds up with Polly Moran. Now watch now how Lon slowly sees what's going on. And the realization now comes. He's still mad at the Baron. Now the realization of how his wife has cheated on him. And by subtly playing this moment here, and now you'll see he starts to express things with his eyes like a madman. But he doesn't overdo it. And then he starts to laugh, and he stops himself. It's a beautifully restrained sequence that Chaney does here that is just so artistically wonderful, and a great lesson in acting. And in this scene, as Lon's character is suffering this, the audience reaches out and offers its sympathy. He wins the sympathy of the audience off of this. And they sympathize with him and want to protect him. And again, that is another theme you will see in so many of Lon's films. And you'll see here where she calls him a fool and a clown and inadvertently slaps him. And it recalls his humiliation in front of the Academy. And then we see the Baron watching this and gives a slight, sinister little chuckle. There, right there, just by smiling. And this, of course, all pushes Chaney's emotions over the edge. What I find very impressive about this early part of the film, when Lon is in the study here and when the Baron and the wife take his papers, is notice the lighting on it. The lighting in this scene is very, very interesting, very well done. It focuses the light on the main characters and certain areas in the background. For instance, the globe is illuminated a little heavier than normal. It just gives an interesting look to things, and also kind of it puts your eyes to certain areas on the set where you pay attention to it. Like watch here now that Lon takes all his work and just throws it away, and it hits the globe. And now we come into another great camera work magic as Lon's character suffers a great humiliation, and now the camera will dissolve. And you'll see the clown, and then you'll see how the clown is spinning this ball, and then we do a dissolve into the circus clowns coming out of nowhere down these ropes. Now, all these title cards here saying what happened to the character of Paul Beaumont takes place because Seastrom actually shot scenes of Chaney going to the circus and meeting the circus owner and the clowns and gets accepted into it. And all that scene was cut. You will see photos in the photo gallery of the dissolved scene. And now you see we've got the globe going. And now, as the clown blows, you see the clowns descending. Again, this was done with shooting the globe first, then backing it up, and then having the clowns, filming the clowns separately, coming down and sitting on the ring, which you'll see dissolves into the circus ring. And now we are at the circus. European circuses, for the most part, played in one place. Like, say, for instance, a circus played in Paris, and they played in a building that had a single ring, and behind there was the dressing room areas and the places for the horses and that. Most European circuses really didn't travel like the American circuses did in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, this is called Clown Alley, whether it was a European circus or an American circus. Clown Alley was where the circus clowns dressed, made themselves up. They all had trunks with their various costumes, wigs, shoes. Now we'll see Ford Serling, who was well known as a Mack Sennett comedian. He was one of the original Keystone Cops. And that's Clyde Cook in the background sitting there. Serling was well known as a comic, but he was also a very good dramatic actor. And most of these white heads that the clowns would wear was either made out of a rubber or a muslin type cap. Like you see the one on Ford Serling that had holes there that would fit over his ear and hold in place that way. In this period of the circus history and the circus here, as we see Ford Serling making Lon Chaney up, how about that? All clowns wore whiteface. They were all whiteface, and it was a term, they used a term, it was called neat whiteface, in that the clown had very minimal makeup on his face. There'd be, like you see here with Chaney being made up, his mouth is made up. The color was always used was red. Occasionally they'd use black for maybe the eyebrows or around the eyes. But red and black were the typical colors that were used for clowns, and it was called a neat whiteface because it was very, very minimalist. Now, there's another term for circus clown makeup for whiteface, and it's called grotesque whiteface. And that has a more elaborate look to it. For instance, the best example is look at Lon Chaney in Laugh, Clown, Laugh. That makeup is what we would call a grotesque whiteface. It wasn't until the late 19th century, early 20th century that clowns started using, another clown came up with a color called aghast. It was more of a flesh tone with black around the mouth, white around the eyes. Two of the more well-known circus clowns that used that makeup was the great Lou Jacobs and Greg DeSanto of later years at Ringling Brothers. The tramp clown, as we know it, didn't come in until about the Great Depression period. And, of course, the greatest tramp clown was Emmett Kelly. And other clowns came after that, Mark Anthony, Otto Griebling, and in later years, some evolved into a combination of a tramp clown and a character clown. Scott Linker in the 1980s and early 90s at Ringling Brothers, he was made up, he had something, he had the dark around the face, the white around the mouth, but he was dressed as a usher. So that was more of what we would call a character clown versus a tramp clown. John Gilbert is here, and this is his introduction in the film. And we're also seeing a new young star by the name of Norma Shearer. This film introduced three of who would become MGM's biggest stars in the silent era, and Norma continued on into the 30s. And it was quite a great big break for all of them, Chaney, Gilbert, and Norma Shearer. Now, going back to talking about European circuses for a minute, European circuses were traditionally a single ring, usually in a large building, and you had one single ring, and the act took place there, and the audience sat around it, around the ring, as you will see a little bit later here in the film. The first American circus debuted in April 1793 in a wooden walled open-air ring in Philadelphia. One of the audience members who witnessed the acrobats, horses, and clowns at this time was President George Washington. The circus expanded to 2 rings in 1872 under P.T. Barnum, who called his circus the greatest show on earth. In 1880, Barnum merged with Jim Bailey's circus, and the new Barnum and Bailey circus now proclaimed 3 rings. The other famous circus was owned by the Ringling Brothers, and they started out in 1884. 23 years later, they took ownership of Barnum and Bailey, being billed as Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus, the greatest show on earth. It would remain the major American circus for the next 147 years before ending its historic run in May 2017. Interestingly, both John Gilbert and Norma Shearer never made a film together after this, although they certainly had quite a presence. Now you see Lon getting his face powdered. You would always set the clown makeup with baby powder, usually in a white sock. It was just easier to absorb the colors. And you'd cover the entire face with the baby powder and then brush off the excess. Now here's something of an ironic scene in that we see Ruth King is having dinner with the Baron, and they look out and they see the circus building, and she laughs about a clown getting slapped. For his role in this film, Chaney was coached by George Davis, who was a professional circus clown from France. Davis also appears in Phantom of the Opera, but Davis coached him, showing Chaney how to be a clown and act a certain way. Now, the gentlemen in the waistcoats that come out and handle the horses and that, in circus terms, they're called, in America, roustabouts. They aren't dressed at Ringling Brothers. They were not dressed nearly as nice as this. They all wore a blue jumpsuit with Ringling Brother name on the back. Notice the symbolism in Chaney's costume, where he's holding this heart that is not perfectly in place and needs to be sewn. And Consuelo will do it for him. It kind of plays into the clown with the broken heart theme that was so well known in so many films and stories. And now we see Consuelo's father with a very rich man. This fellow gets around a lot. Notice how Lon watches her while she sets the heart in place. She's mending his heart, basically, is what we see here, emotionally, because he falls in love with her. Now, in the act of He Who Gets Slapped, you will see later in the film, Chaney's character supposed to be dead, and Ford Serling rips his heart out, this piece of the costume. And of course, we could see here that she's replacing his heart and allowing him to feel love again, possibly. Holly Bain, who went on to work in the film industry as a makeup artist and as an actor under the name of Mike Reagan, remembered his time as a boy when he was an extra in the circus audience here. He said he was sitting in the upper part of the bleachers next to where the performers made their entrances and exits. He said, "I was looking over the rail when I first saw Lon standing in his clown makeup and costume. Two men stood in front of him holding the stilts, and he climbed onto them with such ease, just like he had been doing it forever. I was in awe of him. When he got his balance on the stilts, he looked over at me as we were eye level with each other. He smiled at me and said, 'Hello, son.' All I could do was nod at him, totally speechless with my mouth open. Here was one of my favorite actors who talked to me, and all I could do was nod at him." Now, in his act, he gets slapped for saying silly things, which is kind of ironic. It's really not something you think people would laugh at. But Seastrom is showing the irony of what happened to Chaney's character before, and here we see the distinguished scientists that Chaney is now laughing at as part of his audience as the clowns. It's a very subtle, symbolic shot here by Seastrom, which I think is, he handles this so well. It could easily have been overplayed, but it isn't, and it makes sense to the audience. Now, Victor Seastrom, he was born in Sweden in 1879, and he immigrated to the United States with his parents when he was a toddler. His mother died when he was 7, and eventually relations with his father and his stepmother quickly deteriorated. He returned to Sweden to live with his uncle, who was an actor with the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm. Young Victor became enamored with the acting profession, and by the time he was 20, his performances were gaining critical notice. He left the theater to work in the growing film industry in Sweden, joining the Svenska Biografen as an actor, but soon began directing films noted for their fine stories and subtle character performances. Eventually, he was brought to America by Sam Goldwyn's company and was absorbed into the roster of directors for MGM. At MGM, he made many notable films, including Tower of Lies with Lon Chaney and Norma Shera. Sadly, it's now considered a lost film. The Scarlet Letter and The Wind, which are heralded as classics of the silent era. With the birth of sound films, Seastrom made one sound film at MGM, A Lady to Love, in 1930, before leaving for Sweden. He directed 4 more films before he returned to acting for the rest of his career. He ended his career as an actor in Ingmar Bergman's 1957 Wild Strawberries, and he died in 1960 in his native Sweden. I remember showing this sequence to a couple of my circus clown friends in Ringling Brothers, and they watched it, and after it was over, they said, yeah, that's nice, but we'd probably have to blow up something to get a laugh. You notice the scene where Ford Serling, before he takes Chaney out into the ring, he touches the heart to make sure the small prop heart is in its place. This was an old theater custom called check your props before you go on. There's certainly a great deal of irony in this sequence where a fellow clown rips out a clown's heart and everyone's laughing hysterically, and then he buries the heart in the ground. And now comes the funeral for he. Again, this is kind of odd, not really something one would think in a circus would be very funny, but it does give us something of an ironic touch to the whole story, that we laugh at somebody when they're hurting. Now, we see here the clown's crying, and they're squeezing a hot water bottle that has a tube that runs up underneath their skull caps. That is an old gag that dates back to the late 1880s with circus clowns, and still can be used to this day, although most of the time it hasn't been used, probably in the last 30, 40 years. But it was a standard gag for many, many decades in the circus. And now we see another old standard circus gag where the clown falls through the stretcher. This was a mainstay routine for circus clowns for decades and still is occasionally used. I remember seeing it in 1984 with Ringling Brothers. That gag was used. Tully Marshall, who plays Norma Shearer's father, was a veteran stage actor for years before entering movies and played a variety of characters. He appeared in Chaney's Hunchback of Notre Dame and so many other films. And his career carried on well into the sound era. He, unlike some actors, didn't have to worry about his voice not recording well. And he appears in The Big Trail with John Wayne as a grizzled old scout. And now Chaney is able to get some modest revenge with the Baron under his makeup and make fun of the rich man. This is one of my favorite sequences where the Baron says he hates clowns. And look at Lon's reaction and his reply. And the Baron has no idea who just insulted him. Now, that shot you saw of Norma Shearer and John Gilbert writing, the camera wasn't following them around, obviously, because they were not that accomplished in the horse sequence here. What they did is they placed them on the set, and they had a background that ran backwards and forwards to give it a sense of that the horse was riding, and they would sit there and bounce the platform they stood on to give it the sense of riding on a horse. Lon Chaney was 41 when he made this film. This was made just a year after his big hit, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, had been released. He was born in Colorado Springs on April 1st, 1883, to deaf parents. His ability to communicate to his parents using sign language and facial expression was, of course, a great asset to his acting career. After years of toiling in numerous musical comedy companies, contrary to popular belief, he never, ever played in vaudeville. He only did musical comedies. He was often playing several parts on these shows, serving as a stage manager as well as a choreographer. His entry into motion pictures happened after his first wife, Cleva, attempted suicide on April 30th, 1913, in the wings of a Los Angeles theater while he was performing on stage. The ensuing negative publicity of this tragic act forced Lon to seek work in the growing motion picture industry. He worked steadily at Universal from 1913 to 1918, even writing and directing some productions. In 1918, he left Universal over a salary dispute. The gentleman who was in charge of the studio at the time told Chaney he'd never be worth more than $100 a week. Well, as he started to freelance, he got his big break in the movie The Miracle Man, where he played a fake cripple. And it gave him his first big attention to Hollywood as one of the leading character actors in the film industry. Other roles that gave him more attention to not just the public, but studio producers, was The Penalty, Fagin and Oliver Twist, the dual role as the gangster and a Chinese in Todd Browning's Outside the Law, and the double role of the mad scientist and his half ape, half man in The Blind Bargain. His talent with makeup knighted him the moniker of the Man of 1,000 Faces, and rightly so. When Lon went to MGM as a star, he was one of their major stars between 1925 and 1930. Of course, he did several films with Todd Browning, notably The Unholy Three silent version, The Blackbird, and the wonderful The Unknown in 1927. But Chaney's biggest money-making movie was Tell It to the Marines in 1927, where he wore no makeup and he played a tough Marine sergeant. His performance was so thrilled by the Marines that they made him an honorary member of the Marine Corps for life. Chaney eventually agreed to make talking pictures in the beginning of 1930. He held out primarily because he felt he wanted to make sure that the sound equipment and sound recording was good and wouldn't harm his career. He said, "Why should I try and do something that may die stillborn with the way my box office is?" In 1928 and 29, he was voted the #1 box office male star. Well, Chaney made a new deal with a contract with MGM, and he agreed to do a remake of The Unholy Three using 5 different voices. Several other films had been planned for him, including Sherry Bibby and The Bugle Sounds. But 7 weeks after the release of The Unholy Three, Lon died of lung cancer. Irving Thalberg, who knew Lon from their days at Universal, hired him to play the lead in this film, and he told him that if He Who Gets Slapped did well at the box office, Lon would get a long-term contract with MGM. Well, that deal was signed February 15th, 1925, and lasted until his death. For his work in He Who Gets Slapped, Lon signed a contract for just the run of the picture, earning $2,500 a week for 4 weeks. Norma Shearer, she was born in Montreal, Canada in 1900. As a child, her parents gave her dancing and piano lessons, and when her father's failing construction business happened during World War I, her mother took Norma and her sister to New York in hopes of getting them into show business. After a failed audition with Florence Ziegfeld, Norma eventually found extra work and occasional bit parts in movies that were filmed in New York City. Irving Thalberg had seen her in a movie called The Steelers in 1920 and attempted to sign her under contract when he was at Universal, but she was in New York making movies, and it wasn't until Thalberg moved over to Louis B. Mayer's production company that he managed to sign her to a 5-year contract. She became one of MGM's major stars for the next 12 years, appearing in such films as The Student Prince in Old Heidelberg, The Actress, and The Divorcee, for which she won her only Best Actress Oscar. She was married to Irving Thalberg from 1927 until his death in 1936. She made 6 more films at MGM before retiring in 1942, and she passed away in 1983 at the age of 80. John Gilbert, believe it or not, was born as John Pringle in Logan, Utah in 1895, and he came from a show business family. His father, who later deserted his family, was a leading comic in his Pringle Stock Company. Gilbert grew up backstage watching his mother perform with numerous theatrical companies, and he eventually got his start in the film industry around 1915, playing extra roles in many Thomas Ince movies before he moved up to bit and supporting parts. Oddly enough, in 1920, he and Lon Chaney worked together in Maurice Turner's The Glory of Love, which eventually was released 3 years later as While Paris Sleeps. Signed to MGM by Thalberg, Gilbert's star burst on the screen in The Big Parade in 1925. His pairing with Greta Garbo in Flesh and the Devil was not only a major box office hit, but the 2 stars fell in love during the making of the film, although Garbo left Gilbert standing alone at the altar for their planned wedding. With the arrival of talking pictures, Gilbert faced the microphone with mixed results. His voice wasn't bad, but it really didn't match his screen image. And at the time, a lot of actors got caught up in that having to have that perfect stage enunciation. So it made, when he would say lines like, I love you, which was later made fun of in Singing in the Rain, hurt his chances at the box office. He continued to make movies until his contract with MGM ran out in 1933, but his box office hits were hardly there, and certainly not what he had in the silent era. He made only 2 more films before his death in 1936 at the age of 38 from a heart attack and drinking himself to death. He Who Gets Slapped was a risky venture for a major studio's first release. You have to consider its esoteric subject matter, frequently presented in symbolic scenes, could easily have alienated the average moviegoer. Instead, audiences heartily embraced the picture, and even today it still makes an indelible impression. The movie succeeds with a combination of poetic imagery, refined moods, and numerous dissolves and superimposed images which give it almost a mystical touch. He Who Gets Slapped was released on November 2, 1924, and the critical reception was positive. Chaney's performance was voted as one of Photoplay magazine's best picks, and the production was chosen as one of the top 10 films of 1924 by Photoplay magazine, Movie Monthly, Motion Picture Magazine, the Boston Post, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the New York News. Photoplay magazine noted, "He Who Gets Slapped is a superb thing, and it lifts Seastrom to the very front ranks of directors. Lon Chaney does his best work of his career. Here his performance has breadth, force, and imagination." Movie Weekly noted, "Occasionally an exceptional picture comes along which makes no attempt to pander to the box office. He Who Gets Slapped is one of this sort, an artistic masterpiece. Chaney's makeup, as usual, is perfect, and he gives you a magnificent performance. And Metro-Goldwyn is to be congratulated because of their willingness to buy stories for their sheer artistry." The New York Times stated, "At the Capitol Theater this week, there is a picture which defies one to write about it, without indulging in superlatives. It is a shadow drama so beautifully told, so flawlessly directed, that we imagine it will be held up as a model by all producers. Mr. Seastrom has directed this dramatic story with all the genius of Chaplin or Lubitsch, and he has accomplished more than they have in their work. Never in his performance before the camera has Mr. Chaney delivered such a marvelous performance as he does in this character. He is restrained in his acting, never overdoing the sentimental situations, and is guarded in his makeup." He Who Gets Slapped began filming on June 17, 1924, and completed production 37 days later, July 28th. The circus sequences that we see in the film took 2 weeks, and they were shot on the studio's biggest stage at the time. The film was budgeted at $172,000. Upon its release, the box office gross was $881,000, earning the studio a profit of $349,000. The film broke a record in its opening week in November at the Capitol Theater in New York City, earning over $70,000, when ticket prices ranged from 35 cents to $1.65. This was the only outdoor location for this movie, likely on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Back then, there were certainly a lot of open spaces, a lot of trees that they could shoot things. You know, there was the old adage, a rock is a rock, a tree is a tree, and we'll shoot it in Griffith Park. And there was a reason for that, because they went to Griffith Park a lot because it was close to the studios and easy to shoot. Director Carl Brown once said that it was better when shooting outdoors not to shoot anything between 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. due to the sun being overhead, as you can see in these shots here with Norma Shearer and John Gilbert. Brown felt that doing that, it took away any kind of wonderful shading you might get in a shot, so he never did. Nowadays, you film no matter what. You film in the rain. You film pretty much in any condition now because time is money. Back then, they had a little bit more freedom to be more artistic. Now, we come to another ironic scene in the film where all we see is the Baron picking up his hat, cane, gloves, and he's leaving Ruth King. And notice she's got a string of pearls around her neck, just like what he gave to Norma Shearer's character. Ruth King doesn't get a lot of credit for her performance in this film in reviews and that, probably because it was something of a minor performance, but I thought she does a wonderful job with her reactions, her facial reactions, especially there looking at the check as he walks out. And I think she deserves a little more credit for that wonderful performance. In the actual play, there is a scene between he and Consuelo, very similar to this, where he sits here and he winds up telling her that he loves her, and she laughs at him. Something of an ironic moment. Again, here she is stitching up her heart for him. And this is where his character tells her that he loves her in all seriousness, but she cannot take him seriously. Again, this is a theme in so many of Lon's movies, as I've mentioned before, where he loves the girl and she loves another. And he either sacrifices himself for the girl or lets her go with the one she truly loves. This is a nicely played scene with the two actors here. Lon becomes very intense about her not marrying the Baron and how he tries to tell her he loves her. And the more intense that he becomes, you can see Consuelo becomes frightened, wanting to constantly pull away. Again, this is a scene that, under the direction of a, shall we say, less talented director than Victor Seastrom, who knew how to handle his actors, knew when to let them play it to the hilt or tone it down. He does such a wonderful job here with them. And you feel you feel sad for him. And you know that all this proposing his love to Consuelo is not going to work out for him. It's not going to be beneficial for what he wants. And now you see Consuelo, she can't take him seriously, begins to smile and laugh, which again, as she playfully slaps him, pushes him over the edge. She has no idea how serious he was about professing his love. And again, he will hide behind the clown's face, masking his sadness. And start laughing himself to take away the edge, and then tell her, slap me again, slap me again. Tully Marshall just makes this role so wonderful. He's such a sleaze. Sell his daughter out for money. But again, like all the other actors, he doesn't overplay it. He plays it just right, just enough that you hate this guy. You really don't like him. You want to see him get his comeuppance, as well as with the Baron. Of course, back then, in 1924, the Will Hays office, which was the censor board for all films, demanded that a villain or a bad person had to be punished for their crime, mostly resulting in their death or conviction in a courtroom. But then how is that going to happen? How do you make it happen? In the play, it's almost a Shakespearean tragedy in the sense that Consuelo drinks poison and dies, and he follows her and drinks poison and dies, much like Romeo and Juliet almost. It was a very Russian play, very heavy, very dramatic. And, of course, Victor Seastrom and Carrie Wilson did a wonderful, wonderful job on the script here. If they had done the actual play itself, it would have been too heavy-handed for an audience to sit through, let alone embrace. But with what they've done here with the characters, you have their sympathy. And it's important with characters such as Chaney's or even Norma Shearer's character that you have to win the audience's sympathy. And you can't play it too heavily to get that sympathy. It's a very fine line between being perfectly dramatic and then overdoing it, overemphasizing it, overacting it. Of course, you can see that in several films where you often think, gee, the actors should have toned down their emotions a little bit. It would have made the film better. But Seastrom had a great rein on the actors here and was able to get them to do what he needed and what he wanted. Chaney liked Seastrom very much. He thought very highly of him. He said his values were very fine, and he liked working with him a great deal. It's kind of sad that they only did 2 movies, one of which is missing, where he plays a Swedish farmer from a young man to an old man. I kind of wish he would have done a couple more films with Seastrom, because he was just such a great director in getting that perfect performance out of somebody without letting him chew the scenery. Lon stated one time that he was very interested in how the lions acted with the trainer and then with the man who would feed them. The trainer they would snarl at, like here, because they didn't really like him, because he cracked the whip and such. But the man who fed them, they were virtually like a pussycat, because he gave them what they needed, what they wanted, and they showed their affection and thankfulness by being very kind to him. And they never once snarled or snapped at the man. Now you can see here as they're going by, look at the background of them on the horse, you can see the faces are painted on a canvas. So they were using a backdrop for that scene. Contrary to popular belief, Chaney was supposedly quoted as saying there is nothing funny about a clown at midnight. There's absolutely nothing I have in 50 years uncovered a quote like that from any kind of interview or newspaper clipping. It came years later after Lon had long passed away. I believe years later in the 50s, it was being quoted by a writer of science fiction and horror that he said Chaney said this. But I have never found anything of Lon saying it. Now we're going to come up to a scene here where you're going to have to think, how did they do this? I know I was, as I was preparing this commentary, I was watching the film. Now, keep in mind, I've been watching this film since 1975, one of my favorite of Chaney's works. And I never really sat down to look at it and to try to analyze it. And while we were preparing the script here for this commentary, I started watching it and I caught on how they accomplished this shot with the lion in the room with the three actors. Now you see here, let me jump off here. You see now they do a reverse dissolve here. So they shoot it. They shot Chaney in the clown makeup. Chaney steps out, takes the clown makeup off, puts the goatee on, makes himself up. They shoot him like that in the close-up. After they wound the film back, he steps out, they wind the film back again, he comes back in the clown makeup, and that's how they did the dissolve. But for this scene here that we're going to see, where the lion comes into the room with the three actors, obviously, you can't have the lion in the same set with the actors because who knows if the lion will turn on anybody. So it was a little bit of camera magic. And it was something they were doing quite often back in that period. Today, what they might do is they might set up like in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark when he's in the Well of Souls there and the cobra pops up. Well, they had a glass plate between Harrison Ford and the Cobra, thankfully. Well, you couldn't do that back then with the way this set is set up and the shot is done. So what they did is they reversed to some camera trickery. And what you'll see is when the lion comes in, you'll see Tully Marshall on the left side of the frame and Lon and Marc McDermott on the right side of the frame. And in the center is the lion. So, how was that done? They first shoot the three actors, and what they do is in the center of the frame, they block off the camera frame with a black cloth. They mat it out. And they expose the film with Tully Marshall on the left side of the frame, Marc McDermott and Chaney on the right side of the frame. When they shoot that, they rewind the film back, just like a dissolve. Now what they do is they remove the masking in the center of the frame, and instead they mask the left and right side of the frame, and they bring in the lion and expose the lion in the center of the frame. And then when the film is developed, you see all three in the same shot. And it was a very safe way, very smart way, and easy way of completing this effect. And it's always surprised me growing up and as a budding film historian, how much stuff they did with the camera and within the camera. All these tricks and the hanging miniatures or matte shots and all this stuff. And so much of that was carried on into the sound era, and so much of it is still used today in many respects. Now the technology is a little different. They don't do matte glass shots like they used to. Now they do it all with a computer, but they still have to mask off an area of the frame for that to be on there. It's really quite interesting how much we developed in the silent era that is still in use and still used to this day. It's kind of like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And it's really, when you think of what they did back then with the technology they had, not at all like what we have to this day. It's amazing when you see some of these scenes, like the scene here you'll see in a moment with the lion in the scene, how they did it. And it gives such a great sense of realism that you don't get if you did a split screen or if you just shot the lion and then cut back to the actors, but you don't see the lion and the actors in the same set. Now watch here, you'll see. There it is. Now you can see almost to the right side, there's a line you can kind of see from the floor to the bottom of the table. That'll tell you that's where the center part was masked off and then unmasked when the lion came in. Now, how did they do this scene with Tully Marshall in the lion? Tully ducks. He gets out of the shot real quick. They stop the camera. The lion jumps in. Again, you can see the background there with the painted faces. So you know that they're not going around circles in the ring with the horse. The folks at Flickr Alley have asked me to give you a little bit more background about myself. I spent 20 years as a kid actor, thankfully never robbing a 7-Eleven, and thankfully never successful. And then when I was 21, I switched careers and became a makeup artist. And I was a makeup artist for 40 years, along the way picking up 2 Emmy Awards, which I never expected to get, and worked on numerous shows. And my interest in Lon Chaney is what propelled me into this career. My dad was a man of 1,000 faces, the film biography on Lon Chaney, and I stayed up one night when I was 10 years old to watch it. I wanted to know more about Lon Chaney, and I wanted a makeup case. Well, back then, there were no books written about Lon Chaney. So over the next 40, 50 years, I started digging around and trying to find out information about Lon Chaney. And I also wanted a makeup case. And when I was doing an episode of Marcus Welby, MD, the makeup artist on the show who I had been working with for 5 days, I just bugged him constantly about what was in a makeup case and everything. And on my last day on the show, he gave me his old makeup case. And it was full of pan sticks, pancakes, all sorts of things. And I promptly went home and gave all the boys in the neighborhood a Cary Grant tan, and I started to teach myself, and eventually started at Universal, same studio Lon Chaney started at, and that was my first 3.5 years of my career, and it was a great time. And my interest in Chaney was just solely for myself, and I was working a movie with Burt Lancaster, and we talked about Lon Chaney several times, and I told him stories about things I knew, and he said, "You got to write a book," and I had no faith in myself as a writer. So he said, "Well, then find somebody, but do it." Well, I took my dad's old vaudeville advice, and I did a single act, and I wrote 3 pages, and they were the most god-awful pages I've ever read, because I tried to sound biographical, and it was watching paint was more exciting. Anyway, a friend of mine suggested, "Well, you talk so well about Lon, that you know him so well, try it that way." And thanks to Kevin Brownlow and his wonderful book, Parades Gone By, I liked the way he told stories, so I kind of borrowed from him. And there you go. 3 books later, I've written about Lon Chaney. He's been a tremendous influence in my life, and I will never, ever be able to repay him the debt he has given me. And of course, for he, as he hears the music playing for his act, he must go on. The show must go on, even though he is fatally wounded here. Now you see the blood on the hand of what's supposed to be Tully Marshall, and then you'll also see when he removes his hand from where he was stabbed, you'll see the blood. The blood was actually Bosco chocolate syrup. It photographed better than red fake blood would. Red wouldn't come off as well on orthochromatic and panchromatic film stock, so they used Bosco chocolate syrup. Needless to say, it looked great on camera, but it was very sticky. Years later, the Max Factor came up with a great blood called Technicolor blood that had a glycerin base that was easier to clean up, wasn't sticky. And then when they stopped making it, other people started coming up with fake blood, and they used Karo syrup, which again makes it really sticky. I think Lon plays this scene so very well. He's trying to carry on his act, being the jovial clown. And when he gets slapped here, he sees people applauding, the clowns are laughing. He gets up and he talks about how the clown comes out to make people laugh. But he can't get back up. Notice how slowly the clowns and the audience now kind of realize something isn't quite right. Of all the death scenes that Chaney has done in his movies, I think this is one of his best. It's so filled with pathos and it's so real to me that, you understand the character and you see what's happening. He stands up, now they're applauding him. And he wants to say one last thing. And he looks at Consuelo. Before he dies. Of course, he dies in Consuelo's arms. And as we come to a close, I would like to thank the folks at Flicker Alley for allowing me to share my commentary with you. I hope you found it of interest and enjoyed watching this film as much as I have. Thank you.